Good afternoon. I'm P.J. Norwood, joined today by my co-host Frank Ricci for Fire Engineering's Humpday Hangout for June 24th. Today we have an amazing show to, put together. Unfortunately, we only have 60 minutes to get out some extremely critical and important information for all the fire service. But before we get into that, I just want to extend a little early congratulations to my partner Frank Ricci, who is officially will be retiring from the city of New Haven July 4th. Pretty iconic, perfect day for Frank Ricci to be retiring from the city of New Haven after a phenomenal career. And Frank, congratulations. And I look forward to seeing what the next chapters, because I know there's not going to be just one, the next chapters brings you. So congratulations.
Thank you, PJ. I appreciate that.
Today's show, we're going to tackle one piece of the cancer puzzle that impacts us firefighters. You know, I look at cancer in the fire service as a big old puzzle, and there's a whole bunch of different pieces between, tobacco use and physicals and breathing air and our turnout gear and keeping ourselves fit and in shape and eating right. There's all these different pieces and puzzles, but there's one piece of that puzzle that I really didn't know anything about until probably about a little over a year ago. I started, I'm going to use the word hounded and get a little chuckle out of that by a woman named Diane. And I know Frank is going to mention her in a few minutes, and started inundating me with information. And something about information kind of really, piqued my interest. And then in that plethora of information, she sent me a New York Times article about a lawyer who tackled DuPont, an extremely lengthy article. And I dove into that, and it really kind of piqued my interest on, man, there's a lot more to this story, and there's a lot going on. And since then, I've been trying to educate myself and trying to figure out what I, as a firefighter and a safety officer in a small department, can do to minimize the risk to cancer across the board of all those different puzzle pieces. And what we're going to talk about today is not going to take out our risk of cancer, because we're firefighters. We're going into a cancer risk, high risk environment on every call. But every single piece that we can do to reduce that risk, we should be learning as much as we can, asking the questions to try to reduce that risk. So today, joining us, we have Professor Graham Peaslee. And if I went ahead and read the bios of both Professor Peaslee and Attorney Bilott, who's joining us, that would take up the whole show. So I got two little snippets for the two of them, just to give you an idea. So Professor Peaslee is a professor of experimental nuclear physics. Applied nuclear physics encompassing a broad array of experimental measurements. His research interests lie in the interface between the nuclear or atomic physics measurements, methods, and materials that impact society. And the key to that is how a lot of this stuff that most of us have no idea what it's even encompassing impacts society. And what he's talking about today is how it impacts us as firefighters. And Attorney Bilott, I picked something out of that first article that I read from the New York Times. And the headline of that article says, "The lawyer who became DuPont's worst nightmare." Rob was a corporate defense attorney for, at that time, 10 years, until he took on an environmental suit that would end up his entire career and expose a brazen, decades-long history of pollution. And I would encourage each and every one of you to look up Rob, look up the New York Times article, look up the movie that he didn't get a chance to star in that we were just talking about earlier. They had somebody, an actor for him, but the movie Dark Waters. And you want to learn a little bit more about Rob, and those are definitely ways to realize who we have joining us today and the magnitude of what we're speaking about. So I want to turn it over to Frank for a minute, and then he'll go ahead and he'll push the conversation towards Professor Peaslee and Attorney Bilott.
Thanks, PJ. I think we're really here for one reason, and the one reason that makes America great is the fact that we can ask why. And that's essentially what we're doing here, and that's Graham's role, is to answer why and ask those questions and get to honest answers. I also really appreciate Rob coming on today. Rob, you are a man of principle, and throughout your career, you have demonstrated that you put principle above politics. And I want to talk to you a little bit about my personal experience with DuPont. So the reason I came to fire engineering was because of a film called Smoke Showing. And a lot of people don't understand the background behind that, so I'm going to give it to you real quick. So I worked as a consultant for a division of DuPont, Brookdale, which was out of Vancouver. And they made a filter so that when firefighters ran out of air, they could click in a filter, and not only would it have a filter to filter out hydrogen chloride, acrolein, and a host of other nasty actors, but it actually had a catalytic converter in it that would convert carbon monoxide to CO2. So I looked at all of the science from DuPont and Brookdale, and I was convinced that it was gospel. And I still had to ask why. So we were moving to get a variance with OSHA to allow this respiratory protection to be used only in a last chance situation. So I brought on Yale University and Dr. Cohn to perform a study. And because of the study, we engineered the house kind of like your wife would engineer their living room. We got stuff from Goodwill on the street. We actually furnished a whole house. And the plan was, while being filmed, I was going to change over from my air pack to the Evac Pro in an IDLH environment. A week or so, and this is years ago, so the timeline might be a little off, a week before the actual study of me changing over in that environment, Desmond Main, another man of principle from DuPont, said, you know what, I want to just do a couple extra filter platform tests and a bunch of stuff that probably Graham could only understand. Within a week, he came back and he said, Frank, you can't do a changeover inside a fire environment. The filter's not going to protect you from carbon monoxide. I'm like, what? So the science was good, but what was missing was the way they packaged the Evac Pro was allowing air to enter the package and trigger the filter. So all of these scientists were saying it was great. They were selling it to firefighters for years, and firefighters had it on their side, thinking that if I ever ran out of air, I could click in and it could save me. The fact of the matter is, it wasn't because there was a flaw in packaging. It was because of the heroic political courage of Desmond Main that it ended up being a complete recall from Brookdale and DuPont. I believe it cost them over $70 million and closed Brookdale for good, unfortunately laying off some employees. So we can't just rely on what the manufacturers say. We have to ask why. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm pretty much going to get off my soapbox and leave this to PJ. I want to talk a little bit real quickly about Diane. So in Connecticut, there was the King's Phillips War before everything started in America. And there's a legend that a child was kidnapped by another warring tribe. So the colonists and the tribes got together and they picked their best warriors to go get the kid back. And for 7 nights, they failed. A couple days later, they came into the camp and there was the kid playing with its mom. And everybody's like, how did the child come back? How could anybody possibly have gotten this kid back when our best warriors and the colonists have failed? And they looked at the mom and she said, because you're not his mother. There are people attacking Diane right now. She drove me crazy for months, okay? When people start talking about how you bring up an issue and they don't ever talk about the merits of what you're saying, that should be a big red flag in America that maybe these questions need to be asked. Diane's a mother. She's passionate. She has a husband that's a firefighter and a son that's a firefighter. I personally think that the International Association of Firefighters and Harold Shakespeare should be ashamed of the way they've treated Diane. And I say that as a union president. Oh yeah, Rob, I love your career more than most. I'm going over from the union to a conservative think tank after July 4th, because it's got to be about principle. And Diane, I commend you for your passion, and I commend you for doing the John Adams thing of taking a back seat to this, because she was invited to be on this show today, and she said, no, I don't want my presence to kind of cloud what's going on here, because the work of Graham is so critical. The work of Rob is so critical. Remember, Adams stepped back from writing the Declaration to give it to Jefferson because he was from Virginia. So I have no issue with Diane. The International Association of Firefighters should be ashamed of themselves. And we need to stand with Diane and say, hey, she brought the issue forward with passion, and now we need to ask the hard questions. Before I turn this back over to PJ and I get off my soapbox and stop talking, I just want to introduce my mentor, the guy who I met because of smoke showing and that Yale study, and the reason that I'm here at Fire Engineering all those years ago when we dedicated the film that we made, because we couldn't do the study, to Tommy Brennan, and we filmed how and what firefighters do on the fire ground, is no other than Bobby Halton. Bobby Halton, welcome to the show. You're muted.
I got it. Sorry, guys. Old and in the way. But I would just like to take this opportunity. It's an absolute pleasure, Rob, to meet you for the first time in person. I've seen many, many emails. I've read copious amounts of your work. I think that you're an incredibly courageous person. You're actually the first person I've ever met who's been portrayed in a movie, a feature-length movie, which is pretty phenomenal in of itself, other than the Frank Ricci story. But, you know, but Edward G. Robinson was dead, so they couldn't get anybody close enough to Frank to play, you know, for the role. And there's probably only 11 people in the world who remember who Edward G. Robinson was. But thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Rob. We know your time is precious, so I won't take up too much time. But just to dovetail very briefly on what Frank just said, it's a time for courageous people. And irrespective of how you feel about an issue, any issue, there's never been a more important time in America to speak up. Because, you know, some folks out there are saying that unless you support a certain cause, your silence is complicit. That's not true. But if you've got a strong feeling about something and you fail to express it, that's on you. You know what I mean? That's a bad sign. No one should be allowed to be silenced for any opinion they hold. And I think it was Seneca who said it best. He said that our descendants will be amazed at the things that are so obvious to them that we now don't know. And I think a lot of that has to do with exactly what we're talking about today. You know, the folks who came up with these compounds back in the day did it with albeit the best of intentions. It's unintended consequences. And now we're going through that process. And Rob has done absolutely, by the way, I was just out pulling down a statue of Mother Teresa because I heard she once ran a red light in Calcutta. So she's done, I'm done with her. But so Rob has done courageous work in getting the issue of these polyfluorinated products out of our environment. And they're so widespread, if I'm using the word correctly, right, Graham? I mean, they're virtually everywhere, that we just need to keep raising the awareness. And you know, years from now, we may find out that that these products are responsible for all kinds of things, and we may find out they were, you know, not so much. We don't know. The important thing is to be aware. You know, that's the important thing, and then to keep funding more men and women like Graham to keep probing deeper. Jefferson said it best: question boldly even the existence of a God, because wouldn't he be more honored by your homage than your unfounded fear, something to that effect. And so thank you for being here, both of you. And I'm absolutely honored to be on with you. And I apologize for being tardy, but Rob, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you. And Doc, it's great to have you back. Congratulations on publishing your paper. And
thank you.
I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. And Frank, thank you. That was, I couldn't agree with you more about your words on Diane. So I appreciate you saying that. So Graham, I know if we just kind of unleash you, you're just going to run here because you have so much a wealth of information to provide us. But I kind of want to keep this a little kind of focused. I know that you released a new study yesterday, but if you would give a brief explanation for those that may be hearing about these forever chemicals for the first time today with this show, give a little brief introduction to what they are, where we find them, and kind of what has brought you to this point and the release of this new study.
Very good. Thank you, PJ and Frank, for inviting me on the show, and Bobby for hosting. It is an honor to be here. I think I could talk for hours about this, as you're right. Any given academic can do that. But I think the spotlight today is on the firefighter, and we want to be very careful what we say about this report. It's now published in the Environmental Science Technology Letters. That's the reason we did that, is we wanted to put it in a premier journal. It took us well over 18 months to get there. It's a long time to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, and we picked the #1 environmental science journal in America because that's where it belongs. It's an important issue, and it's there. And it came out yesterday after lots of peer review and lots of comments and lots of things we had to fix, quite frankly. But we did a preliminary study of looking at turnout gear and we were interested in the issue of PFAS being in them. PFAS being used in the manufacture or being used in the construction of the gear that keeps you guys safe. I was aware it existed only because of Diane, as we've talked about. She wrote with a heartfelt plea to take a look at her husband's gear. And so I did. And I said, wow, that's a highly fluorinated textile. It's very functional. It's the reason this PFAS is used is to, in this case, impart water resistance to the gear that you wear. Because as you know, you're wearing a lot of equipment, it's very heavy. If you were to get wet, that gear would be even heavier. And so it's to save the 40 pounds of water weight that would soak into the gear if it weren't waterproof. It doesn't add extra flame retardants and things like that. It's not functionally done for that. It's done for the water resistance and the oil resistance. And so that's why PFAS is used on the textiles. I had no idea about the fire service's use of this before 2 years ago. I discovered it was used heavily on one garment. So my questions were pretty fundamental. I said, is it everybody has the same gear or is it some gear only? And if it's there in such abundance, does it come off? If it doesn't come off, we're done. It's safe, no problem. But if it comes off, then you have the potential for the gear that you wear to shed PFAS into the environment. And some of that environment is the firefighter, him or herself. So we did that study, and there's another facet to it, which is, does it get into the firefighter? And that's yet to be done. But the first study is now complete, and we put it out there. Service personnel in the fire departments to volunteer articles of clothing to us. And we took a look at used gear and new gear. We measured the fluorine levels to see where it was and where it wasn't. And the first thing we discovered, of course, is most of the gear is manufactured very similarly because there's an FDA 1971 standard that requires it to be manufactured very similarly. Well, that was good news. I discovered the obvious. So then we went through and we measured that it was highly fluorinated. There are two types of fluoropolymers used. One is on the moisture barrier and one is used on the outer layer. And both are designed to keep waterproofness. The moisture barrier keeps the moisture on one side and not the other. It's Teflon. And on the outside, there's a side chain fluoropolymer, so-called, that's used to keep the outer shell dry. The cloth that's the thermal liner inside is generally not fluorinated. Almost all are not fluorinated. And then we looked at them, and lo and behold, this not fluorinated inner liner became fluorinated with use. And so the older the gear was, the more that was building up on the inner liner. And we also measured what was lost from the outside, and some of the fluorine was lost on the outside. And this is evidence that it came off. We kind of knew the hypothesis that it would, because all textiles that are treated with these types of waterproofing agents do wear out with time. You know that the carpets in your house are Scotch guarded. The same principle applies. The chemicals used never go away. They're forever chemicals, so-called. So why would they stop being water resistant? The reason is that they wear off. A high wear area on your carpet, or the sunlight and water that gets onto them wears off, soaks off. And that's what we did the study to do. And we measured it, and we measured it several ways. One was with our technique of total fluorine, but that's just fluorine. You don't know it's PFAS. So then we actually sent the samples out and had the fluorine measured by a commercial lab that did an excellent job. And we measured which PFAS chemicals were there and that were coming off. And there's a lot of discussion. We can go into hours into the various PFAS chemistry, but I'll say that, you know, people are worried about PFOA largely in due to Rob's extraordinary efforts to have PFOA measured in so many people. And we know the risks associated with PFOA. It's a clear and present cancer risk. It's also implicated in 4 other diseases. And so those are significant findings that were done from a huge epidemiological study. We are also concerned about other PFAS, the replacement chemicals, so-called, and the ones that aren't on the big screen. Those chemicals that are, there are 4,700 of them. PFOA is the star, but there are lots of others, and we don't know the health implications of those, but they're not looking good. All the preliminary studies on animals are not looking good, and in many sense, they get further than the PFOA. So they're more soluble, they last in the blood very long. There's all sorts of bad omens about where these things are going to end up, even though the studies aren't complete on the health studies. It'll take decades to finish them all. So what did we discover? We have PFAS chemicals on all the gear. We have quite a few of them. Measurable quantities in the part per million range on the gear that would transfer off. We found an alarming fact that the hand, in manipulating it, the gloved hands of my students were actually able to capture fluorine. That was, we hadn't intended to find that, but my students were inventive, and they said, hey, we were handling the gear. I think they were putting it on, they weren't supposed to. And they're students. But they measured their gloves afterwards, and they measured the transfer of fluorine to their glove. And I said, you know, people who are wearing these gloves as a profession every day, as a badge of honor, are not wearing gloves when handling this stuff. So could it transfer the hands? I'm sure every firefighter washes his hands before he eats, especially since COVID. But boy, do they know that this gear could shed material. The first thing I'd like to say, well, this is not the first, but the first important thing that I'd like to say is that this is in no way a statement that you should stop wearing gear. That PPE is what keeps you safe in a fire. It's designed to keep you at 300 degrees for a while. That's amazing. And that gear is designed to do that, and it functions very well at that. Please do not stop wearing your gear. However, if the gear could be made safer, why wouldn't we? And is it essential to have fluorine chemicals on that gear? And that's the point of this article. And my argument is that, yeah, even if not all the toxic ones are there all the time, the toxic ones are there, and the other ones we're suspicious are toxic are also there in great abundance. They do come off, and it presents an exposure risk to the average firefighter and to the environment in which they live. What I'm going to suggest is that, you know, the fire services have all sorts of policies in place. They have policies on how to do decontamination, and you know that combustion products are very dangerous. So there are policies to how to decon and keep your SCBA on before you decon, because that's all sorts of policies that were made on the fly as people discovered how to be safer on the job. This is an example where if I inform the fire services now through the publication of this paper that Diane was right, there is a threat there. I don't know how serious it is. There may be bigger threats. Certainly running into a burning building is a bigger threat, and you guys do that every day. How do you make that risk assessment when you do that and when you don't? How do you make a risk assessment? You won't know until we do all the studies, and a real proper study needs to be done with NIOSH to determine the extent. Is this bigger than AFFF, or is it the same size? But in either way, even if there's a trace amount of this coming off on your skin, what fraction gets into your body? We don't know that yet. But if it were large, and this will be worn every day, as opposed to municipal fire departments do not use foam every day. Militaries do sometimes, but typically the foam exposure may not happen as frequently as wearing the gear. So even a little bit every day might be similar to one big shot at an AFFF exposure.
Graham,
so this, yeah.
One of the things that Bobby has talked about is being battle ready. I think when we talk about chemicals, we talk about exposure and time. And one of the issues with our fire gear, maybe because we think it's cool, I'm not sure. But the fact of the matter is we wear it all the time. We wear it to car accidents. We wear it to the grocery store. We wear it in the bay. Firefighters are wearing structural firefighting gear, battle ready gear. I hope I'm quoting Bobby Houghton correctly, all the time. And so just to not wear it when you need it at a structural firefighting training facility, but we don't need that level of protection. Maybe we need coveralls for car accidents and wear regular uniform for medical calls and things of that nature. Bobby, do you want to speak to that quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly, battle rattle, there's a mindset that in the military, it's called putting your plates on, battle rattle. When you put your battle rattle on, your mind changes. You go green too. Everything else, car payments, trouble with the wife, husband, whatever, that's gone. It's all about the mission, survival, and having each other six. The problem is if you wear your battle rattle all the time, your mindset doesn't change. Like I know a good attorney, a good attorney probably has power suits, right, Rob? But ones that you feel more comfortable in, they give you a little more confidence before you go in before a big case, right? Everybody's got those things that they do. Well, mindset matters. And if you're wearing your gear casually all the time, when you go somewhere downrange and your life is on the line, your mindset doesn't change, and that's a real problem. So that's an ancillary issue. But to Frank's point, it's gear degradation. Now we know there's potential for these chemicals being shed, possibly inhaled, ingested. We're not sure. There's a plethora of reasons. And even today, Graham, if you go to Facebook or anyplace else, you'll see firefighters. I was sent 2 pictures today for the cover of I swear to goodness, our wellness supplement to put on the cover of a firefighter working out on an exercise bike in his gear.
Yep.
I'm not making it up, Rob. You can't you can't make up the really good stories. So and just one quick final thought. Nassim Taleb, Black Swan writer, Fooled by Randomness, and Certero, several other great books. He has told us that we've survived for thousands and thousands of years as a species because we've overreacted to threats, much like we do with COVID. Initial reaction was massively over the top. That's a good thing, because if you underreact, you die. Self-preservation is its own reward. I mean, right? I mean, so I find it appalling, and I credit Diane, I credit Graham, and especially Rob. We need to get this issue out there. And the bigger issue, Graham, and I'll say this plainly, is that these products, and Rob can probably speak to this more eloquently, they're not just our gear. I've got a slicker because I'm a wannabe cowboy. So I've got my Streets of Laredo costume. It's 15 years old. I'm sure it's full of, PFAS because it's waterproof and everything else. I've got, I'm out there in the duck blinds and things like that. Everything there is, I don't know what that stuff's made of. And I'm not saying that the people who did it were bad people or malfurious people. They may have been. I mean, there are bad people out there. I don't know that. All I'm saying is I just want the people I love and care for to know that if you, as Graham just said, look, we're not saying throw out your gear. We're saying wear it when you need it, but don't wear it when you don't. And when you take it off, store it correctly so it can't further contamination until we know more. Did I say that right, Rob, or am I off the rail completely?
No, I fully agree. In fact, one of the main reasons I wanted to participate today, and thank you all for providing this opportunity. I think this is an incredibly important discussion that we're having for just that reason. I mean, knowledge is the key here. We have been working for, almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades now, to try to get information out to everyone about what these chemicals are, what these PFAS chemicals are. And we've focused on one of them. It took 20 years to get information out to the public about what one of them may do, PFOA. And now we're starting to learn, there are hundreds, and as Dr. Peaslee mentioned, thousands, but potentially in this class of PFAS chemicals, and more are being created. And particularly as companies, as information's finally coming out about the two that are the most notorious, PFOA and PFOS. The ones that primarily have been used in all of these different commercial products over the years, including firefighting foams, AFFF, stain-resistant carpeting and clothing, fast food wrappers, packaging, car waxes, I mean, you name it. As people are finally starting to realize those chemicals are an issue, and maybe we need to move away from them. We see folks moving toward different chemicals, but in the same chemical family. And the more information we can get out, and the more people can at least be aware of what are these things, what are the risks, and most importantly, how are we even being exposed to these? Most of us had no idea we were being exposed to any of these chemicals until just recently. These are chemicals that have been out there on the market, being pumped into our environment, being put in commercial products, including coatings used in turnout gear and in firefighting foam for decades and decades. And it's only been, within the last, really the last year or two, that the general public is even starting to become aware of this. Meanwhile, none of us had a choice, really. None of us really even knew that by putting these products on, or by wearing certain things, or using firefighting foam, or using other particular products, that we were exposing ourselves. So the more information we can have about where these chemicals were used, what kind of products were they used in, in this, the study we're talking about now is an incredibly important piece of that information, to know that these chemicals likely had been used in some of these coatings, and likely have been used in some of these products in the past. And how do we then, knowing that, finally start to at least stop those exposures, minimize them going forward, and at least have some better concept of how we're exposing ourselves without even knowing it. And really the critical problem has been for quite some time, this information simply wasn't made available to us. It wasn't made available to the public. It wasn't made available to the firefighters or the people that were using these products. It was incredibly difficult. Even if you asked what's in this stuff, you didn't necessarily, you were never given that information. A lot of that was kept as confidential business information about what chemicals were in the mix of this super secret proprietary coatings. So it's been incredibly difficult to get that information out and to at least get people to start thinking and at least being aware that these exposures are out there, because really up to now, as we've brought this information out about PFAS chemicals and risks, most of the focus has been on drinking water. This stuff's getting out into the water and we need to stop that. And critically, we do. But if you think about it, why are people concerned about it being in the water? Because when we drink it, it gets into us and it gets into our blood. And, unfortunately, this stuff has been getting out into people's bloods for decades. The regulatory agencies have, for at least 15, 18 years now, been trying to find out, how is this getting into everybody's blood? What products have these chemicals been used in? Have been trying to get this information. And, it's fantastic that we now have this paper that's at least telling us one part of this puzzle. One additional place that we now know these products may have had these chemicals in them. Here's maybe at least what we can do to start minimizing that exposure. And maybe, and also, here are folks that are moving away from these. It's that, is there an option? Is there a choice we can make? Are there things we can start doing to avoid those exposures? But this is the critical first step, knowing that exposure exists and knowing the extent of that exposure. That's the only way we can move forward and do things to minimize it and to move away from these things and to stop that exposure. It's likely been going on for decades and decades. Sorry, that was a long answer.
That's okay. Graham, we know that there's no doubt in my mind, based on your research, that these chemicals are present in our turnout gear. We also know that they're present in everyday materials, like we just discussed. My couch, my car seat, the seats in my cars, the clothing that we wear. How do the levels, or do we even know how the levels in some of those everyday chemicals compare to the levels that you're finding in our turnout gear?
Yeah, we can do textile comparisons, and firefighters win on that one because you have the most waterproof gear ever made. I mean, their outdoor wear has, as Rob suggested, turned away from this material based on earlier discussions they had. They're phasing out fluorochemicals in the Columbia jackets and Nike jackets and things like that. And in those materials, they're less than what we see in the firefighter gear because these are really highly engineered garments. They've been designed out of textiles that really have the most water resistance because somebody said it was the most important. And I think the follow-up question that I'll ask, there's all sorts of questions as why it was put there and things like that and who knew when. It doesn't really matter. If we have an alternative that will work, why does it need to be this chemical? And that's my argument to the manufacturers who knew nothing about this at the time. They were just told it was safe, fine. Or to the same people who sold you the foam, it was supposed to be safe. It says safe as soap. Well, guess what? It wasn't. And I think it's precautionary. Maybe this will not represent a big hazard. Maybe it's all foam. Maybe it's all the couch. Maybe it's all wherever you're getting it from, the microwave popcorn. But I think that you take aim at what you can. And what I'm taking aim at here in this paper is that, is this waterproofing agent need to be that one, or are there better chemistries that can give you the same functionality, meet NFPA 1971 just fine, yet not be fluorinated? And what does that hurt other than being precautionary? It doesn't hurt a thing. And that's where I think that information can be really valuable. And the fire services have to decide policies. I'm not going to tell in a paper what fire services should do. I made suggestions like wash your hands, but I'm not going to go beyond that. You guys know where the gear is, what it's used for, whether you exercise in it or whether you wear it to library functions. and it's a badge. You guys are self-identifying with this, but you also have been around combustion products long enough to know that there are parts of the skin that absorb more than others. And if there were any of this shedding on the skin, could it be absorbed more? Yeah, makes you think about wearing the gear so closely as so often, or keeping it in the trunk of your car, or not extracting it, or keeping it separate at work. And those are suggestions that the firefighters themselves will design policies, and they'll be fine. And some rookie's going to be vacuuming more than they are now, or something of that level to keep the environment safe of dust. But it's
Graham,
not. Yeah.
Now, I don't know if this is in your level of expertise. We, as firefighters, we definitely want to keep our gear dry to a certain extent because wet
Absolutely.
gear lacks thermal stability.
Yep.
Do you know if there are other processes or other chemicals that aren't forever chemicals that could achieve that, or is that a question for another day?
No, I've been told by people that manufacture this that there are materials that can be used that are not fluorinated. They won't be as water resistant, but almost as water resistant. So you take number 2 instead of number 1. And often the distance between those two is not very different. And I know of one textile company that has come out with a product that's fluorinated free that meets NFPA 1971. They said so. And they've just marketed it. They read the tea leaves a year ago from a Diane post of all things and said, I wonder if we have a plan B. Sounds like a very sound strategy to me, because if you had the option, why wouldn't you take the safer or the less likely to have toxic chemicals if it's functionally effective? And I can't evaluate functionally. You're right. I'm not an expert in fire gear. I don't know whether it works in a fire. That's what you guys have to test and make sure it's compliant, that it does the job that it's supposed to do and not get wet. But once you've determined that, why wouldn't you choose the one without the toxic chemicals if that's an option? And you have to, it's a question of does it work as well, et cetera, so forth. And I'm not an expert in that. But I think this is just starting the discussion. I think those committees that make such decisions should have these discussions and employ the experts that they need to find out whether this gear is safe and whether it can be done. And it's not going to happen overnight. So in the meanwhile, the general policies you'd make as fire services do about anything, combustion products, or the policies of where and when you eat, or how often you're up and down in the gear, those sort of policies are always made by the fire services and should be. And this will just an extra piece of information now that you know what would you do to minimize risk. And I think there's lots of reasons that it should stay in the fire chief's hands as to what the operational procedures should be. But I think the discussion should be there right now. And Rob's absolutely right about the impact this has on everything else. I mean, the first responders are, of course, a very special category. But think of our armed services that wear uniforms, or our flight attendants that wear uniforms, or all sorts of other services that this is being added without our knowledge. And I think that's a job as a scientist to sort of say, hey guys, we're seeing this show up in polar bear blood of all places. Why the heck are we making it? And I don't understand why this is necessary for this environment. I understand keeping firefighters safe, absolutely. And I would not hesitate to, and if it were not coming off the gear, this would be a much simpler publication, say it's fine. This is just says there's a cause of potential for exposure risk, and we should be taking that seriously.
I'd like PJ to talk a little bit about gear decontamination, but I have one question for Graham before we go back to PJ. Mm-hmm. There's a process and policies that have taken place now that firefighters, especially when they have 2 sets of gear, which is ideal, they're decontaminating on scene, they're getting washed down, then they bag their gear, the gear gets washed, which I think is great. My question is, do we know, or have we looked into it? Is it a better practice to just remove the gear and bag it and then decontaminate it? Or when we decontaminate the gear that's on a firefighter, are we actually pushing those chemicals into or onto the firefighter's skin? I don't think anyone's talked about that issue. I
don't think so. And excuse my ignorance if I get this wrong, but my belief is that the firefighter stays pretty dry, even hosed down on a decon, because that gear works. It keeps them dry. And so we are washing some of it down the sink, and that's probably environmentally not a good place for it. But in terms of keeping the firefighters safe, I'm not worried about that exposure. I think the decon is much more important for combustion products. Those are very dangerous. And so you're doing the right thing there. I think the gear being bagged and extracted properly at the station house would be a great way to do it. It will put some more PFAS down the drain. That's why I want to get rid of the PFAS in general. I'm more worried about the environment at that level. But I think that the keeping the firefighters safe I would not alter or suggest alter those policies. Those seem like the correct ones designed so far.
Rob, it looked like you had a thought earlier. You want to dovetail on Graham there?
Yeah, I was just going to make the point. You were talking about whether or not there were other alternatives out here to this type of chemistry. And just one example I always refer to, because I heard this in a seminar out in California last year. In Denmark, they had made the decision they did not want any more PFOS chemicals in the microwave popcorn bags. And at that point, the folks that were making those coatings said, well, we can't do it. We're going to have to take all of the product off the market. It's, we just can't do this. Well, it was all taken off the shelves. But that market force then led to somebody coming up with a PFOS-free microwave popcorn bag, and all of it went back on the shelves, and was only a matter of months, from what I recall.
It was about 18 months, but here's the fluorine-free and Danish popcorn bag. And in the United States, it was a U.S. company, and 8 years later, the United States has now got its first fluorine-free popcorn bag too.
Well, and I think just to really quickly dovetail, but and to quote some of my favorite people, isn't that Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand? I mean, and most recently it would be Matt Ridley from England, the House of Lords, who just published his How Innovation Works, right? There's a need for a product. Some companies already found a way to do it. And okay, right now it's in second place, but I guarantee you that there's some smart chemist out there, some good, somebody who's wrapping their head around this saying, okay, wait a minute, what if we add this or do that? And so I think that this should be seen as a tremendous opportunity, not as a hindrance. And plus it's a tremendous step forward in what we all want to do, is create a safer, cleaner, healthier planet. Because at the end of the day, Viktor Frankl taught us, it ain't about us. Unless you're doing something for somebody else, you've missed the meaning of life. And the meaning of life should really be doing something about subsequent generations and generations and generations. And, if this is a forever chemical, at some point in time, if you're really smart, you'll be thinking about a way how to vacuum it up. Like the fellow who figured out how to get the water out of Prince George Sound, the concrete, it was a concrete guy. He vibrated the water, and that made the oil come back together so they could suck it up. So, that's innovation. And yeah, it took 20 years. But today with the WWW that you kids embrace so much, information moves so much faster, right? And you would think that we'd be getting smarter instead of collectively dumber, but there's that argument's open. So that notwithstanding, I had a couple of questions that come to mind. Short term, your paper's out, right? And we've got Rob here. And so I think there's some really great opportunities for a self-promoting character like myself to say, first, I know Graham's already coming to FDIC 2021. Rob, we'd love to have you there. And we'd love to create a session for you to be able to talk about the work you've done environmentally, because it is important to us. And many of us, like myself included, feel that, I did stuff unintentionally to the environment with what I was doing, and I poured tons of AFFF all over the place. I don't think the people who made it meant to do any harm either, but I want to get more awareness out there so that people know, hey, you may have groundwater contamination you're not aware of. You may have, and Dark Waters is a wonderful movie. If you have not watched Dark Waters, it's spellbinding. It's phenomenal. And Rob is not actually in it. There's an actor who plays him, who does a wonderful job.
There's a cameo.
Yeah, do you do a cameo? I didn't. Oh, you did. Oh, okay.
You gotta watch it again. Watch for him.
Oh, kind of like the Spider-Man movies where you always see that guy walk on. So that being said, that's important to us. Secondarily to that, Graham, I read your paper. It's phenomenal. And Rob, I've read your work. But as firefighters, it would be lovely if we had something. And I don't say dumb it down, but you wrote a peer-reviewed my son has a degree in physics, and I was calling him up saying, what the hell does this mean? And he's like, Dad, you won't live long enough for me to explain that to you. So maybe just a softer version, for public consumption would be helpful. And then also, Rob, if you could help us a little bit with, the efforts that you've done in raising awareness? How do we, because we've been talking about this now in the fire service really intensely for probably 5-6 years now, Graham? Pretty intense.
For AFFF or for PFAS in general?
Well, AFFF, PFAS in the gear. PFAS in the gear, at least 3 years, 4 years, right?
It's only been about 2. It's been pretty recent.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, it feels long.
2.5 for Diane. 2.5 for Diane.
Okay, well, Diane might make it feel longer. I'm just teasing. She's watching right now, so she knows what I mean.
I'm sure.
So how do we, as an organization, as a service, how do we express ourselves more eloquently to the folks that serve us about our desires to be more responsible environmentally, more responsible about our own physicality and that of our families and friends? How do we do that, Rob, without sounding like shrills?
I think having events, like this, where we make information available, try to convey it in the most direct manner and in the most objective manner, just to say, here are the facts, here are what we know. We're wanting to give you the tools, to at least start making these decisions and at least starting to be aware of this. And that's something I've been trying to do, is anytime there's an opportunity like this to have folks making this information available, an outreach like this where people can be watching or can call in or ask questions. I think anything that could be done in that regard is tremendous. It's been very difficult. I know Graham could probably talk about this as well, but even today, it's extremely difficult to get this story really picked up and really talked about, even with the media. It's just been very difficult, even with the movie. And I did a book as well, and there's a documentary out there. But it's very hard to get a discussion going because it's seen as hyper-technical scientific stuff and a bunch of legal stuff. So like you say, if there's a way, that we can have these forums where we can just talk about it in plain English to folks and explain, why is this important? Why is this something we want to talk about? I'm all in favor of it. And any way that we can do that, any way that can be done, I would highly encourage.
And I think it's important to realize none of this has anything to do with COVID or Black Lives Matter, or all the things that are facing the nation right now that are important, but it's important to the firefighters to know this. And this is why we're doing it. This is why we didn't pick the time. I would have loved to have done it before all this, but it's one of those things that we get the message out and we just be consistent and answer people's questions. There's one question that was emailed to me, which I think is an important one. What if you're a wildlands firefighter and not municipal? Is that gear have it? Turns out the wildlands firefighter gear does not. There's N equals 1. We had one set, but it has brominated flame retardants. Great, that's an index and disruptor, glorious. So there are other issues with it, but and there was a trace of fluorine that turned out came from the belt, the bag that they carry, the Teflon bag that was rubbing off on it. But in general, those are technical piece of information. People have questions. What about me? What if I did this, or what if the material's worn? Does it come off more? Yeah, it does a little bit, but it's still plenty of material left. You don't lose the water resistance. So there's all sorts of technical questions people will have, and I will be on every forum I can get to try and answer those as best I know. But there are other experts out there that can start to run with this too.
Chief Fawn, I think this may be a question or something for you to discuss, because multiple years ago you took Frank and I up to Globe Manufacturing, and there's a piece of that tour of something that I really learned. I assume Globe, it's their gear. But what I learned during that tour and during our substantive education was they take the textiles and they assemble the gear to make it Globe gear. But that textile that they're building that gear from is very similar to the textiles that other manufacturers to assemble their gear is using also. So Chief, is it still true that there are only a few textile companies that then sell to the manufacturers of the gear?
Yeah, there are predominantly about 5 major textile companies that produce fabric that's used in the manufacture of American firefighting gear. I don't know about internationally, but in American firefighting gear, it's predominantly 5 very responsible, very decent companies. And then remember that the textile is then treated. So you have additives that are then done to the different textiles. So it's multiple companies and multiple processes And depending on how you spec your gear, that's what has to be done to it, right? Like what kind of thermal protection level are you looking for? And then how much particulate are you looking for is going to determine what types of fabric they put into the gear that you've spec'd. And that's a lot of local control. But to Graham's point, the standards that they set for permeability, if that can be met by a non-toxic substance, as Rob's been talking about, then yeah, that's a better alternative. That's the invisible hand. That's the way the market should work. Remember, PJ, when we first started to introduce, well, I remember when we first started to introduce flame retardants, and Governor Brown, with albeit the best of intentions and with a solid, good heart, decided in California we'd have the safest mattresses in the world. So they added the most amount of flame retardant, right? And then we found out that made them highly toxic to lay on, which was a bad thing. And now we're also learning that one of the worst products of combustion is flame retardants mixed in with products of combustion. So because they just retard combustion, they don't prevent combustion. And then they become, aerosolized, and we inhale them, and it's horrific. So yeah, PJ, to your point, there's a small number of companies that produce textiles, a small number of companies that produce additives, for lack of a better word. I'm sure there's a better chemical word for it, that they have to add to make the textiles perform in the way that's requested. Think of ARC, think of the guys that work with high energized equipment. They have to wear clothing that's not only fire resistive, but that has lowered conductivity. So they have to add things to their gear. We don't worry about that so much, but as we see more and more energized electrical fires, think of electric cars, think of solar panels, think of all the innovation that we're under, that's going to become a bigger issue for us. So we're going to be looking at that very closely. So remember, you never want to be fighting the last war. You want to be fighting the next war. And that's the way to stay ahead of the curve. And that's what Rob is doing for us. I mean, he says 20 years, and I get that, but believe me, at my age, it doesn't seem like such a long time. You know what I mean? I'm obviously the oldest guy on this call, but the point being, it's a great question, PJ. And so, and to Graham's point, it's very complicated how it all comes together. And so we need to be constantly looking at every aspect of our gear. And to Graham's point, the effects of water inside the gear and heat exposure, we used to have a lot of theory about, you fry the firefighter like a lobster. So we need to look at how true some of that was, right? We have much better instrumentation today. A lot of that's anecdotal. And so, and that's fine. I'm not saying that, old wives' tales aren't always true. There's always a certain degree of truth in them, right? So anyway, we need to look at everything. And to Graham's point, maybe it doesn't really make that big of a difference and I don't know. The good thing about being old is it's easy to say you don't know. But remember, with open cell foam, right? We used to, after we found out how fast it off-gassed and how fast it combusted, now what do we do with it? We still use it, but we package it differently so it doesn't combust as readily, so it doesn't dissipate. So there's all kinds of ideas that we can start to float around about what to do going forward. And to Rob's point, that's a good thing.
So to backtrack a little bit and to summarize on a few things. So we know, based on Graham, based on your work, that our gear has these forever chemicals. But as of this point, we're still waiting for additional studies to know if and how much of these chemicals are entering our bloodstream. We know that they're there, but we yet don't have the data to define that it's actually entering our bloodstream. And then thirdly, we currently don't have any alternatives except for limiting our usage of the gear in the proper times, like EMS, moving away from wearing structural firefighting gear to EMS. Is that accurate?
Yes. Well, that's good. And it's, in fact, what we say is that it's an exposure risk, but it has to be evaluated as to how big. You certainly can take proportionary principle and say, don't wear it when you're, lounging. But things like that are policies that will come in place. But I think the end result is that, is it necessary? And that's a good take-home message. Are there other chemicals that could do it more safely for the firefighter?
Graham, your study also establishes not only are the forever chemicals there, but the forever chemicals are transferring off the gear onto the firefighter's skin. So the next step is we got to find out is what's the damage and how much is getting absorbed into the body, correct?
Exactly. And those studies are undergoing right now. I know of at least 3 groups that are pursuing the dermal absorption approach right now.
And that's with credible science?
Very credible. The people, it'll take a year to come out, but we'll have some very credible results out of that. Only one of them is my group. The other 2 groups, one in England and one in the US, are also doing great jobs.
So Graham, one other thing I want to, as we start getting towards the end of the show, one other thing I would like to briefly discuss is the dust of the brake of the turnout gear and the recommendations of if we're going to carry our turnout gear, say for our volunteer force, to carry that gear in a turnout bag or a sealed container. One, we should be doing that post-fire control anyways for the products of combustion. And now let's talk about a clean set of gear that one of my volunteers goes to a fire, brings it back to the firehouse, extracts it, cleans it, and then he or she's going to put it back in their trunk. What's the importance of them storing it at that point in a enclosed either bag or container?
I think that would be a great policy. It's a question of practicality. Many of the volunteers have only 1 set, not 2, like they're supposed to. Many of them are working between 2 jobs. They've got it in the trunk of the car for ease of access. They're not keeping it at the station. And that's those sorts of things are not going to be hard to avoid. But if you see the kids playing in the gear, if you know it's got a toxic chemical on it, are the kids going to play in the gear as much as they used to? Probably not. It's just a mentality. As Bobby said before, you get in the frame of mind, the gear is important. It keeps me alive, but it's also got a chemical in it that I'm not so sure of, and I don't really want to expose my family to it. I don't want to expose, and that dust. There's also a dust study coming out, hopefully very soon. It's been submitted for publication. That was on fire station dust out of Harvard, and they did a nice job of showing that the dust is got lots of carcinogens in it, and it's good. We all eat a little bit of dust, but this is some dust you might want to avoid, and you can see the dust in different locations have different amounts of PFAS. And I think this is the type of thing that if we gather that information, then the rookies might be dusting a little bit more than they used to, or some policy comes in place to keep the dust segregated from the living areas or to keep the dust out of the eating areas. But that may not be a main exposure route, but boy, it makes sense just to do because it's a pretty low cost to get a cleaner environment for the firefighter. And I think those sort of low cost, high reward ones are the ones that are going to be in place. And you guys have to decide what's valuable. I'm not going to tell you whether you shouldn't suit up before you go on a call. That's a response time question as well as all sorts of other questions that come in. But I know that some departments actually do suit up once they're there because they know it's a fire call. And at the moment, it's just an accident. And so the local department actually told me, well, we have that bin in the equipment that keeps all the gear if we're not going to wear it. And it's got about an inch of dust in the bottom of it. Should we do anything about that? I'm thinking a vacuum would probably be a good idea right now. And that's something that I didn't think of because I didn't know. I honestly don't know what the policies and procedures are for most of the departments, and I don't want to inform them. But if results like that, I'd be happy to answer and say, yeah, probably getting rid of the dust is a good idea. Don't eat your gear, but that's already pretty clear. And I think we're talking about accidental exposure and unintentional consequences. And that's where you guys are really good at risk abatement. You should learn this is just an extra factor.
Frank?
The problem, Graham, seriously, I just did this motion here, and Rob, when you're working hard and you're sweating and you do stuff like that, and there you go.
Has anybody ever had poison ivy? I got it on my wrist 2 weeks ago, and I have discovered all the places I shouldn't touch that poison ivy can go to. It's great. And there's this wonderful video that was done for the San Francisco Fire Department, and a firefighter covered her with shaving cream and said if she didn't decon, where would these decon products go? And they followed her around the control room. She took the gear off, sat against the equipment. There's shaving cream all over the equipment. There's shaving cream on the desk she was sitting at, shaving cream at the plate of food she got. She put it in her hair. She touched her hair. It was amazing where the shaving cream got. It was just a video to show where these products go. If you think that way about decon, why don't we just add this as one of the other things you think about? That it's like decon. You want to keep it segregated as best you can.
Well, Graham, I want to congratulate you on your paper and your hard work and dedication.
Thank you, Frank.
And Rob, the same to your dedication and, being such a principled individual. And I know that anytime you do anything based off principle, everybody wants to be there with you at the end, but while you're going through it, it is the loneliest place in America. So I really appreciate your dedication and passion and helping us as Americans. Graham, I can't leave the statement hang out there about the departments that keep their gear in the case for when they get there. I do believe that every decision should be made locally. Absolutely. I am a conservative. However, if you wanted a completely safe job, you should have joined Public Works. We need to manage risk. It's always still got to be about the victim and about safely, efficiently, and effectively mitigating the fire. This is a dangerous job. You do this job long enough, you're going to get hurt. But we also need to be smart about that. And we need to do everything we can to minimize the risk while still maintaining the mission. I'd like to give Rob the last word because it's an honor to really have you on the show. I'm going to be watching the movie tonight. I'll be looking for your cameo. Bobby, we always give you the last word. I'm just going to the guest, and then I'll let you finish it off.
He's going to take it either way, Frank. You know that.
He's the guy that controls the clock. He's like Father Time there. Rob's got to work for a living. There's people to sue in America.
Well,
Rob, so if we can give you the last word before we go to Bobby, I really appreciate it. And again, it is a true honor to meet you. And I know the struggles. And I really appreciate your wife and your family because they went through hell for what you did. And I can't wait learning more about it. But I know what it's like to be alone. So I appreciate it. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. And thank you, all of you, for providing this opportunity and getting this information out, particularly Dr. Peaslee. This is incredibly important information. It's adding to the big picture, and it's it's another building block here in getting the information that we all need. And thank you so much for providing this opportunity. And hopefully this discussion will continue. I appreciate it.
Bobby?
Well, just to wrap it up, and I will be quick because I know Tammy's got other commitments to our producer, but I think the fire service needs to know that, Professor Peaslee and Rob are two of the most respected voices in America. And I've read Rob's book. It's phenomenal. The movie's great, but Rob's book will knock your socks off. You want to read that. You talk about profiles in courage. It's a profile in courage. And we need more courageous people like Rob fighting for everybody, not himself. There was very little upside to him taking on what he took on, and except that it was literally the right thing to do. That people always say that, but the people who really do it, like Frank said, take a tremendous toll. And I think the fire service needs to know that these two men are not trivial people. They're not casual people, and for them to take the time and the amount of effort that the professor has put into this work, and the amount of effort that Rob has extended on our behalf, is phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. And we owe them a tremendous debt of gratitude. I don't know how else to say it. I hope that every firefighter who knows you, who interfaces with you, treats you with the dignity and kindness and respect that you deserve, but even more importantly with the gratitude that we all feel towards you. And I'm not just saying that because my niece Sarah is in your class next semester, Professor, and I'm just kidding. She is, but I'm not even tell you her last name. So, and it's Rachel. But anyway, and if I say black, I didn't mean to say that out loud. Just kidding. But I mean, these are men of tremendous consequence for American society today. And for them to take the time to be with just three dumb firemen, firefighters, is amazing. And we're so grateful, and we really appreciate it. And we just like to let you know that, if there's anything that we can do to support you going forward, please don't hesitate to ask. And I think I speak on behalf of every firefighter out there. We greatly appreciate what you're doing for us. We think the world of you. And so please watch Dark Waters and get Rob's book. It's phenomenal. And try to read Graham's paper. It's a mind bender. But I think the summary is pretty digestible. And so I would, suggest it to everyone. And thank you.
PJ, can you tweet out a link to Rob's book, and I'll retweet it, and a place we can find Graham's paper. Hopefully we'll have you both at FDIC when FDIC comes back next year, strong as ever. And we really appreciate it. And Graham, remember, you were tasked by Bobby Halton today. We're going to make this truck company simple. You're going to take that paper and write an article for Fire Engineering. Maybe Rob can chime in on it. And
please check out Last Call Foundation. Go to lastcallfoundation.com and you can get tons of more information there.
Yep. And I think we'll get you the paper. No problem. Thank you, gentlemen, for being offering this venue. It's really been helpful. And thank you
Rob,
for your
you'll
service.
send us a link for the book.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much. Everybody
Thank
have a
you.
great day on behalf of Fire Engineering, FDIC, and Bobby Halton. It's been an honor. And I believe this is a great show. And as Americans, we need to continue to ask why. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.